Jesus in the Talmud, what Jewish texts say or hide about him. Why would a rabbinic text that rejects Jesus mention his name with such serious accusations? Witchcraft, deception, execution. What exactly does the Talmud say about Yeshu? And why have people tried to bury this for centuries? It all begins back in the 1st century CE, when Christianity, at first a small movement within Judaism, began to claim that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah of the Hebrew Scriptures. But to traditional Judaism, that wasn't just a bold claim. It was heresy. Over time, the divide between the two faiths grew deeper, marked by theological clashes, censorship, and silence. And in the middle of that tension, one unsettling question still echoes. Why does the name Yeshu, which closely resembles the Hebrew form of Jesus, appear in rabbinic texts like the Talmud? Was it just a common name? Or is there something more? Something the rabbis chose not to say out loud, but left behind, between the lines? To uncover that, we first need to understand what the Talmud actually is, and how it still shapes Jewish thinking today. The Talmud isn't a single book. It's a massive compilation of rabbinic debates on how to interpret and apply the Torah, the law of Moses. It's made up of two main parts: the Mishnah, a codified collection of oral teachings finalized around 200 CE, and the Gemara, the rabbinic commentary and discussions on that Mishnah, written down between the 3rd and 6th centuries. Unlike the Bible, the Talmud doesn't tell a story in a straight line. It's built as a dialogue filled with questions, disagreements, and counterpoints between scholars. It's a living tradition of interpretation, shaped over centuries by rabbis trying to answer the questions of their day through the lens of Scripture. That's why its language is dense, layered, and often cryptic. It takes deep knowledge to unlock its meaning. This complexity means the Talmud talks about everything: civil laws, rituals, ethics, medicine, astronomy, even names and figures that stirred controversy within the Jewish world. And in the middle of these thousands of pages of debate, some unexpected and deeply controversial characters appear. One name in particular stands out: Yeshu. Scattered across the rabbinic discussions preserved in the Talmud are references to a singular name, Yeshu, spelled with the Hebrew letters Yod, Shin, Vav, YSHV. This name has sparked intense debate for centuries. To many scholars, it's an alternate form of Yeshua, the Hebrew name of Jesus of Nazareth. But why does this specific form show up here? And could the rabbis really have been referring to the founder of Christianity? One of the most cited texts comes from Tractate Sanhedrin 43a, which describes the execution of a man named Yeshu on the eve of Passover. He's described as someone who practiced sorcery and led Israel astray. The timing, Passover Eve, and the charge of deceiving the people strongly echo the trial and crucifixion of Jesus as told in the Gospels. But the Talmud doesn't tell a linear story. It offers only a fragment, a shadow, of something familiar told in a different tone. And here's where things get even more sensitive. Many scholars believe the spelling Yeshu, without the final Hebrew letter ayin, which would appear in the full form Yeshua, was no accident. According to this theory, the rabbis deliberately dropped the letter as a form of disrespect, an intentional slight. Some even argue that Yeshu functions as an acronym for the Hebrew phrase Yimak Shemo V'Zikro, meaning, may his name and memory be erased, a traditional curse reserved for enemies or reviled figures. If true, this would mean the Talmud wasn't just recording history, it was taking a stand, a resistance text, pushing back against the rise of Christianity. Others, however, disagree. Some say Yeshu was simply a common regional abbreviation for Yeshua in places like Galilee. Others suggest the rabbis may have used this version to intentionally distinguish the historical Jesus from the mythologized Messiah exalted by Christianity, a deliberate line between the man and the myth. One thing is clear, the presence of Yeshu in the Talmud is no typo, nor is it just another character. He is a figure marked by rejection, accusation, and controversy. And that raises another uncomfortable question. If this figure was irrelevant, why was he recorded at all? As Christianity rose to dominance in the Western world, Jewish texts came under intense scrutiny. They were censored, monitored, and in many cases, destroyed. The already fragile relationship between Christians and Jews quickly turned into a battleground for intellectual control and suppression. During the Middle Ages, especially between the 11th and 15th centuries, the Catholic Church ordered a systematic review of the Talmud. Rabbis were pressured, often under threat, to erase or alter any passages that could be interpreted as insults against Jesus, and that included nearly every mention of the name Yeshu. Manuscripts were confiscated, put on trial, and burned in public across various parts of Europe. In some regions, Jews were only allowed to study the Talmud if they used censored versions, reviewed and approved by church authorities. As a result, in most printed editions from the 16th to 19th centuries, many controversial passages disappeared or were softened, removing any direct criticism of Jesus of Nazareth. But some pre-censorship manuscripts survived, hidden away in libraries and private collections, and these texts reveal something striking. References to Yeshu were more numerous and often more explicit than most had imagined. Still, they remain fragmented, cryptic, and hard to decode, buried in layers of rabbinic discourse, ambiguity, and coded language. Beyond the Talmud, there was another highly controversial text, the Toledot Yeshu, a popular medieval Jewish narrative that mocked the story of Jesus. Clearly satirical, this work was persecuted even more harshly, circulating underground, like a cultural form of resistance in the face of rising Christian pressure. In other words, what remains about Jesus in rabbinic texts is only what survived censorship and fear. Yet even amid this imposed silence, there are traces that couldn't be fully erased. Despite the historical restrictions and censorship that shaped rabbinic writings, a few surviving passages in the Talmud still contain serious accusations against the figure known as Yeshu, and though these mentions are brief, their content is striking. Some scholars suggest that by condemning Yeshu as a sorcerer and deceiver of Israel, the rabbis were rejecting not just a man, but an entire doctrine that threatened the structure of traditional Judaism. In that context, sorcery didn't necessarily mean magic in the modern sense. It referred to the use of signs, wonders, or supernatural acts performed outside the divine authority recognized by the rabbis. One line of interpretation argues that the accusation of blasphemy tied to Yeshu was rooted in his challenge to the religious authorities of his time. He reinterpreted the Torah independently, questioned oral traditions, and openly defied established norms, all of which were pillars of rabbinic Judaism. Moreover, the Talmud appears to suggest that Yeshu led people into apostasy, drawing Jews away from the path of the law and toward teachings seen as heretical. From the rabbinic perspective, this wasn't just theological disagreement. It was a direct threat to the spiritual and social fabric of Israel. Some interpret these accusations as an attempt to respond to the growing influence of Christianity, which in its early stages was seen as a dissenting movement from within Judaism itself. Rejecting Yeshu in the Talmud, then, wasn't just a rejection of a man, it was a rejection of a new religion that was rapidly spreading beyond Judea. It's important to note that even when these mentions are offensive, they are not mere insults. They reflect a deep theological conflict, where Yeshu was not seen as a distant myth, but as a real person, someone whose ideas still echoed among the Jewish people. To the rabbis, he wasn't a symbol. He was a false teacher, dangerous, real. Despite the presence of Yeshu in some Talmudic passages, traditional Judaism avoids speaking openly about Jesus to this day, and that silence is no accident. It's rooted in both theological priorities and the historical trauma of persecution and survival. First, rabbinic Judaism has always focused on the law, not the figure of the Messiah. Even among Jews who await the coming of the Mashiach, there's little emphasis on debating possible historical candidates. The Messiah's identity, according to most rabbis, is a mystery reserved for God's timing, not something to be speculated about constantly. Second, there's a crucial historical factor. For centuries, Jews were accused of killing God, persecuted for denying Jesus as the Messiah, and often forced into public debates with Christian clergy. In such a hostile environment, any comment about Jesus could be weaponized against them. The safest strategy was silence. Some scholars suggest this silence was a form of intellectual self-defense. Avoid the name. Avoid the conflict. Focus on the Torah, on the Talmud, on preserving the tradition. In doing so, Judaism carved out a space of quiet resistance in the face of Christian dominance. There's also the possibility that the rabbis simply didn't want to give more visibility to someone they viewed as the heart of a heresy. To speak of Jesus, even critically, risked amplifying his influence among Jews, and that was the last thing they wanted. But in the end, there's a more subtle truth. Silence also speaks. When an entire tradition avoids naming or responding to such a powerful figure, it's not forgetfulness. It's a choice that reveals both fear and conviction. While traditional Judaism often avoids the subject, many Christians do the exact opposite. Especially in the field of apologetics, references to Yeshu in the Talmud have been closely examined as possible historical evidence for the existence of Jesus outside the New Testament. For some Christian scholars, the mere fact that rabbinic texts mention someone by that name, linked to execution and accusations of sorcery, suggests that there was a real historical figure behind the gospel tradition. Even if rejected by the rabbis, Yeshu is still acknowledged as someone who existed and made an impact. Moreover, some argue that when the Talmud describes Yeshu as someone who performed miracles through strange powers or deceived the crowds, the rabbis may have inadvertently confirmed Jesus' public ministry, albeit in a distorted and critical way. In that view, the hostility isn't a denial, it's a reaction. Some Christian authors go even further. They say if even Jesus' enemies wrote about him, that strengthens the credibility of the biblical accounts. The logic is simple. No one wastes ink on a fictional character. If the rabbis were so disturbed by Yeshu, it's because he was real, influential, and impossible to ignore. Still, serious scholars urge caution. Not every rabbinic mention of Yeshu can be confidently linked to Jesus of Nazareth. There are debates over dating, context, and even the identities of the individuals involved, so using these texts as historical proof requires balance and responsibility. Yet for much of the Christian world, the Talmud, perhaps unintentionally, ends up reinforcing the weight and presence of Jesus in history. The figure the rabbis tried to erase, or at least neutralize, continues to echo even in the very texts that sought to silence him. The Talmud does not recognize Jesus as the Messiah. That stance is clear, consistent with rabbinic tradition, and has remained firm through the centuries. And yet, it cannot fully ignore him either. The passages that mention Yeshu, even after centuries of censorship, omissions, and veiled language, suggest that someone by that name left a deep imprint on the Jewish religious imagination. This is not just some forgotten figure. This is someone who sparked debates, stirred reactions, and was remembered even under the veil of denial. Some texts accuse him of sorcery, others of blasphemy, some call him an apostate. But almost no one dares to say he simply never existed. Even the silence surrounding his name speaks louder than many words, and that leaves us with a haunting question. Is the Talmud really talking about someone else? Just another forgotten heretic from the past? Or is it referring, however cryptically, to the same Jesus that Christianity proclaims as the Son of God. If this video made you reflect, share your thoughts in the comments, always with respect. And if you want to go even deeper into this powerful comparison between Judaism and Christianity, watch our next video, The Jewish Messiah versus the Christian Christ. Why are they so different? Right here on the channel. Until next time, peace and truth on your journey.